I can't find it now. This is it. It's going to happen. And oh, there it is. Oh, it's got about two cans now.
About blended non-binary curriculum and how we can ensure that there's more diversity when we look at the role of women within curriculum. So first of all, I just want you to have a look at this image and think what could be behind that purple box. Now, my guessing is that some of you will have got this correct straight away and you would have guessed that it is in fact women building a wall, but most of you will have thought that actually it's probably women delivering a child or carrying out floristry. And what we've got to do is we've got to question why it is that you would have that interpretation. And it's probably as a result of the curriculum that you were delivered as a young person. Because actually, if you were given a wider, more diverse curriculum and weren't just introduced to kind of 1066 in year 7, you would actually have just studied about the Anglo-Saxon women and the fact that women had a lot of agency at that time. So if we have a look at things such as financial independence, women in Anglo-Saxon time before the Normans were actually really quite independent, and also in terms of divorce, the woman could leave the husband, which is quite interesting considering the Divorce Reform Act, which was just a few decades ago here. So this is a further argument about why it is that we need to ensure that we've got diversity in the curriculum to avoid there being these stereotypical views. So what I did was I did a Twitter audit and I had a look at, well, what is it that we are teaching in our curriculums at present? And this was in 2019. Now, as you can see, the predominant amount of it is that we look at the Tudors, so Elizabeth and Mary. We have a look at the suffragettes, Florence Nightingale, and it seems to be that therefore we're kind of giving a very restricted kind of specific history to our children, and issues can result from that. And Katie Rawlinson does give a more diverse history, but as we can see, even she begins to think actually we need to rethink what we cover so that there are more women incorporated into the curriculum. Women such as Ada Lovelace that you can see just before, and also people like Rosalind Franklin, Dorothy Hodgkin, and Dr. James Barry the bearded lad, so someone who was actually born as a female but lived as a man in order to be able to be a surgeon, as women weren't able to do that at that time. So why is that an issue? Well, when we look at this, well, when the banknote issue came about and Carolina Criada Perez was involved in this kind of debate, it was that there was a lot of men that were selected for it. And the question rose as, well, why? Why is it that it seems to be these? And a lot of the arguments were, well, men have done more significant things. Well, actually, that's not true. And no one deliberately sought to exclude women from the banknote kind of debate, but it was just that the committee that was set up is highly male biased, so it was men, and so they looked at things through a male biased lens. And what we need to do is make sure that we've got greater diversity, not only in the committees that we have, but also that people have that wider spectrum and knowledge of our rich and diverse tapestry. And it's not just genders as well, disabilities, cultures, ethnicities and religions. And also when we think about it, socio-economic class as well, because Jane Eyre was one of the ones that was selected. She was the female, but she's very upper class. What about the middle and working class women who have achieved great things in our past? So when we have a look at it, it's not just in history that we see this issue. We've got there in science that we've got Rosalind Franklin and her DNA work, the idea that she was not only not given a Nobel Prize for it, but she's consigned to a footnote within science specifications and also within the history of medicine as well. When we have a look at the music specification in 2015, a student had a look and she found that from 63 sets of work, that not one of them was by a woman. So that again raises issues of diversity, because it's incorrect to say, well, that's because there weren't female composers at the time, or their work wasn't very good, or they weren't very significant. Actually, it's more interesting to look at the parameters that were placed upon them. So things like they were limited in their composing and where it is that they could perform. And actually people like Felix Mendelssohn, what he did was he published a lot of his sister Fanny's work under his own name. So women were significant, and it is right to include them and not look at significance through the spectrum of the time in which this work was created, but instead think, what do we consider to be significant? And just covered up in the top corner there is Dame Evelyn Glynis. She is someone that I would consider to be significant, and she should definitely feature in our specifications. And as we can see, that yet has not come through. So what have we got issues there within history? So what we've got is that when the curriculum change happened under Gove a few years ago, Key Stages 2, we've got 2 Tudor queens. We've got Elizabeth and we've got Mary. And then Key Stage 3, what we've got is Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole, George Eliot and Annie Besant. And as you can see, that is a very small time frame. History is centuries. It is thousands of years, and yet we are focusing on the 1800s upwards, and a very particular type of woman as well. And what we can see is that leaves issues as to kind of ignoring the role of women, their significant contributions, and also kind of like a wider diverse spectrum of history beyond kind of political significance. When we look at Agnes Huntington, she's got a very important kind of story to tell, and yet she's not included in that. So how do we avoid this absolute truth and people perceiving their view as universal? Well, Caroline talks very eloquently about a situation where she was discussing with her boyfriend and he gave his perspective. She talked about things and she included the female perspective, and he considered her view to be niche. And because that was different from his absolute truth, the canonical kind of perspective that he'd been taught, when actually that was just the male bias that he was looking at. And what we need to do is we need to change that. There needs to be a new absolute truth which considers both perspectives, because that view is not universal. So why is that an issue? Well, when we look at it, we've got things like separation history. So we've got women kind of like within a 10-week module. It might be that you have one lesson on women because you've got to because of the national curriculum. And that can distort the students' perceptions of what makes events significant. We get things like, say, if we were to do the Tudors and then all the way to go to the suffragettes, which seems to be the common thing that we saw from our Twitter audit there. First of all, what were women doing for centuries? Were we alive? Were we there? But also that leads to issues such as children saying women weren't significant in the 18th and 19th century because they weren't involved. And that's because we haven't taught them about any of them. So actually we need to include that. When we're looking at the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, where are the women within that? When we're looking at the abolition campaign, where are the women within that? When we're looking at the miners' strikes, where are the women within that as well? So we need to make sure that we don't have this suddenly women just pop up out of nowhere within history and exclude them for centuries. And we need to also make sure that we're diversifying and showing women's significance beyond just the political spectrum, but also economic and social. So people like Lord Pembrey Reeves, who we can credit with this, the kind of the creation of the early Sure Start centres and being the basis of that. So we need to do that to make sure that there's not an unconscious bias. The idea that girls and boys will think that there's certain careers that they're pigeonholed into because that's what they've learned about people from in the past. We need to make sure that it's a tool of empowerment for girls, that they realise that there are other careers and areas within which they can rightly make strides, and also to help boys having stereotypes reinforced against themselves, but also against women there as well. So if we have a look again, if it is that you are constrained by the fact that you can't include a greater breadth of women, if you are confined to smaller topics, then think about how you can broaden those. So if we have a look at Elizabeth there, going beyond, was she, why didn't she get married, Virgin Queen and the Spanish Armada? Instead, why don't we have a look at, well, what about women running households during that time, tending to injuries and providing medicinal advice? Catherine Fenkel, who was a business owner. Added to that, if we think about a greater diversity, we've got Black Tudors by Miranda Kaufman. Where are they when we study Elizabeth? We've also got suffrage. How do we avoid that pop-up phenomenon effect? Medicine, how do we make sure that it's not just Nightingale and Seacole? And Germany, how do we move beyond the policies of the Nazis and actually have a look at the wider role within women? And please, 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 can we diversify Mary? Bloody or not, and the fact that she was unpopular due to her husband is something that we need to kind of include a greater history about. So if we revisit that Bank of England campaign issue, you can see the reason why we need to is when they asked some children about it, they said, oh, Jane Austen, she wrote a book compared to these big scientists and stuff. I think it's hard because of women's role in history. I'm not saying it's right or anything. It's hard to find any women who are, I was good at saying important. Do you know what I mean? And that's because of the curriculum that we delivered to them. We've also got, I'm not saying Jane Austen isn't great, but like if you were to put a woman on who hasn't done something as much as men, I think it makes the situation worse. So these attempts at trying to include kind of diversity through the banknote, it's kind of, we need to go back to it can't be the cart before the horse. We've got to make sure that we are including a richer, diverse curriculum so that they understand, well, actually, we need to challenge that because we've studied about these women and they're not included in this debate. Where are they within this? So we can look at sources from women from the past, so we can use them as instruments there. So, for example, you could look at craft produced by them, newspapers, personal archives, cross-stitch. And what we can also do as well, we can broaden our curriculum to include things. So I've given 2 examples. So suffrage, instead of just all of a sudden doing the suffragettes out of nowhere, the kind of the wilder versions of the suffragists, let's take them through a wider narrative of the rights of the Anglo-Saxon women, go through to the normal women and how women were then confined. We then look at medieval women and significant ones within it. women during the Enlightenment, the 18th and 19th century, and the 20th and 21st century. And that can be drip fed all the way through our Key Stage 3 curriculum so that they have that wider knowledge and understanding. And the same with medicine, rather than it just being all of a sudden Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale pop out of nowhere. Actually, let's go back into the medieval times. Let's look at the witch midwives. Let's have a look at Dame Trot and Trottola and find out more about these women so they don't just think all of a sudden women were involved in medicine in the 1800s onwards. We do know about them caring in the home, but we need more diversity within that. So we need to make sure that it's blended, not binary. We need to include a range of women's curriculums. And if it is that you're concerned about your exam constraint, then just remember other relevant material must be included. If it is relevant and accurate to the question at hand, it's not wrong and you can include it. So if you're interested, please do get in contact. I'd love to continue the conversation more and enjoy the
oh no! What happened there? That wasn't me actually that cut Alex off at the end there. She cut herself off. She really did. I wouldn't have done that. So please, if you're interested in what Alex